Okay, so hello everyone, good morning and good evening. Uh, we're very happy with this event. Okay, so I am Daniel Ferraz and this is Luciana Carvalho Fonseca. We are both from the University of São Paulo, curso de Letras em Inglês, the English Department of Modern Languages, and we both coordinate GEELLE, Grupo de Estudos sobre Educação Linguística em Línguas Estrangeiras. So we are here really to do a very brief introduction of our event, and I'll start sharing something that we always do, and this is especially for those who don't know our project. And of course, by doing this, right, Luciana, we are also inviting people to join us. Lou, can you tell me if you can see the slides?
It's fine, yes.
Yeah, okay. So this is the third special talk. So as you will see, I will show you the two previous ones. And this one is a special talk with Dr. Jennifer Alford from Queensland University of Technology and Dr. Joe WIndle, University of South Australia and Universidade Federal Fluminense, graduate / postgraduate program. And the topic we are discussing, or the topics we're discussing tonight and this morning, is critical literacies in Australian and Brazilian contexts, okay? So just for you, so as I told you, Luciana and I coordinate GEELLE, Grupo de Estudos sobre Educação Linguística em Línguas Estrangeiras, something in English like study group or research group on foreign language education. And this is our channel on YouTube. Over there you have all of our events from last year. We had the third cycle of talks, and I think we had 14 talks throughout the whole year. And this is our email, geelleusp@gmail.com. If you wish to talk to us, if you wish to join us, or if you wish to know more of what we've done. Basically, what we've done is to study, discuss, and problematize teacher education in Brazil, more specifically English teacher education with students from all levels of all educational levels, such as undergraduate students, teachers, in-service teachers, pre-service teachers, also masters, PhD students, and researchers and scholars. So it's been really nice. And yeah, our project, our group is also connected to the national project of or on literacies that was coordinated by Dr. Montemor and Dr. Menezes de Souza, and it's now being coordinated by me and Ana Paula Duboc. So this is the website, okay, if you want to know more. In July, we are organizing our national event. It's an annual event. It's going to happen next July. And this was our first special talk this semester. And it was with Luz Mary Quintero, Universidad del Valle de Colombia, and Lemário Menezes de Souza, University of São Paulo, Critical Pedagogy versus Critical Intercultural Decolonial, Challenges for Teacher Education. This is recorded. You can type the title or you can type GEELLE, Daniel Ferraz, and you will find it. And this one was in Portuguese, Dr. Rojo and Dr. Montemor. We talked about multiliteracies. It was a very nice talk with Roshani and Valkyria. And to close our very short cycle of special events, today we have Jen Alford and Joe WIndle. And we would like to thank you very much, Joe and Jennifer, for being here with us. It's a Saturday early morning in Australia. And I apologize for my confusion with time zones, Jesus Christ. And what we're basically doing today in part one, after this introduction, Joe will talk first, and Joe will basically talk about his perspectives and his experiences in terms of critical education, critical literacies in Brazil and in Australia. And Jen will talk about an international perspective of critical literacies. She has just organized and edited this book here, a wonderful book that we will highly recommend. And Joe and Jennifer, in our group, in our very small group, let's say, we read Jennifer Alford's chapter and the introduction of the handbook already, of course. And we decided to read Making Sense of School Choice, at least the first chapter in our study group from Dr. WIndle. Okay, and then part two, we're doing the YouTube questions as usual. So please ask questions, make comments. Please join us because I think it will be. I'm sure it's going to be very, very nice conversation. Okay, I'll pass on to Luciana. And once again, thank you very much for being here with us. Remember that this is recorded, so you can always access anytime in the future, let's say, as well. Hi, Lu.
Hi, good evening, Danielle. Good evening, everyone. I would just like to read a short bio of Joel, WIndle, and Jennifer Alford. And I'll start with Joel's because he's the first speaker. He is from the University of South Australia. His research and teaching focuses on cultural and linguistic diversity, and in particular, how community-based literacies can make curricula more inclusive. Michelle, eu acho que dá para chamar os convidados já para cá, já que eu estou lendo a respeito deles, né? Isso. Joel is currently leading an international study on innovative teaching practices involving partners from Brazilian and North American universities, as well as community-based organizations and school education authorities. His research has received support from the Australian Research Council, or CNPq as well, and the State Research Foundation in Rio de Janeiro. Among his publications, we have Making Sense of School Choice, which was one of the readings for our group, which was awarded the Rayon Connell Prize for Best First Book in Australian Sociology, and actually another prize, the Stephen Crook Prize for Best Book in Australian Sociology. Joel is a qualified secondary teacher of English as a second language and French, having taught in Australian and French schools before working in higher education. And he has over 10 years in Latin American universities and experience as school-based teacher education in school-based teacher education projects. Welcome, Joel, and thank you for being here with us. And I'll read Jennifer's bio before she speaks. I think that's
Yes.
Right? So the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Luciana. With that biography, that's why I look so tired. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. It is election day in Australia. We have a federal election today. So it is a momentous time. And it's also a good time to reflect about critical literacy and its role in society and in schools. And I'm aware, of course, that in Brazil, it's also an electoral period because there's an election coming up this year. So I think that electoral politics do, to some extent, bring attention to the ways in which literacies are contested and constructed as part of the political landscape. Danielle, am I passing back to you to ask me some questions, or am I going to show my...
No, you can. Well, it's up to you, but we can project your slides. Is that okay?
Excellent. Sounds good.
Yeah. Is it okay if I stay here with you, or you want just to be yourself at the screen? I
mean, of course you can stay, Danielle.
Okay.
Okay. Well, what I want to say firstly is that continuing on from the first point I made about the political context, is that critical literacy, comparing Brazil and Australia, the starting point is to think about the different histories of political and civil society in those two countries. And in particular in Brazil, the history of the military dictatorship from the 1960s to the 1980s, which is the context in which critical literacy grew up as part of resistance to that regime and as part of a movement that spread globally because of the exile of Paulo Freire and because of the international networks that he created through his exile, and then in the period of redemocratization, the importance in Brazil of civil society organizations. And in fact, that's true across Latin America. And I know the previous meeting included Colombia, which also has a history where civil society has historically played a strong role and continues to play a strong role because of a state which has been authoritarian, which has been absent. And although the Australian state, of course, is also subject to criticism, there is a different history, and there is a different history of progressive politics, a different history that involves the environmental movement, the green movement as being quite prominent in the period when critical literacy was emerging. So in Australia, we have a movement of critical literacy into primary schools, in particular through figures like Alan Luke, who became the head of the Department of Education in Queensland, so had an important role within the education administration. Just as Paulo Freire had a role in São Paulo in the administration of the municipal school system in Brazil. But in Australia, we have the four resources model, which continues to have some influence in schools, but we also have a very strong move away from critical literacy in current policy. And what we have as the remains of critical literacy are in environmental education, are in as well an interest in Indigenous curriculum and Indigenous perspectives, which are a required part of the national curriculum. And that legal requirement has been generating the production of curriculum resources, so and children's literature. So I think there is a positive move in thinking about how there is a relationship between policy and resource production. And I think that's similar to what we can see in Brazil, where policies like the National Textbook Program, PNLD, do generate the production of valuable resources that include critical perspectives. So the Australian Constitution, for example, is very vague. It doesn't mention schools, really. It doesn't mention how schools are funded. It doesn't reflect the reality of Australian government and society. It was drafted in the end of the 19th century. That's very different to the current Brazilian constitution, which was produced from a moment of intense activism and community involvement in national politics with the post-dictatorship constitution, which gives to schools the role of making citizens. And so I think that policies like the OSEM, Orientações Curriculares do Ensino Médio, have had an influence and continue to have an influence, and that influence is less now, of course, and is vulnerable now, but we also have developments within our understanding of what is criticality. So we see in Brazil a strong interest in decolonial critique, particularly in the work of people at USP, and particularly in so-called foreign language education. And we also get efforts to disconnect English, French, and Spanish from colonial powers, and to treat languages as lingua francas or as tools of anti-oppressive, anti-imperialist, and local action in Latin America. So I think that is another point of difference, is that in Australia, critical literacy has been basically in first language education and in primary education in terms of its development. As a French teacher, I can tell you that critical literacy was not part of foreign language education. As I learnt it and taught it, we had ideas like intercultural competence, which are connected, and we did have an attempt to connect teaching to social issues. So like everywhere, you will find units of work in textbooks that are about the environment and so on. So that's why I'm giving the environment as kind of the example of a mainstreaming of critical literacy, which has gained acceptance, which is not controversial. And that's quite different to issues like gender and sexuality, which are also part of critical critique, but which are increasingly under attack or increasingly questioned as part of curriculum. So that's kind of a very brief summary of where I think things are moving. I think that the conclusion of that critique is that critical literacy usually comes from outside of schools. It's not a top-down model, it's a bottom-up model. So whatever is happening in terms of critique outside of schools, and in fact outside of the academy, I think is going to affect what is visible to critical literacy researchers. And I can give one example in relation to environmental education. One of the early and foundational texts for the 4 resources model offers students the chance to criticize or reflect on a project to develop part of the coastal landscape and turn it into a tourist resort. So this is a scenario where it's obvious that we can reflect about what's the impact of development, who benefits, and so on. But interestingly, in the original version, we don't get much discussion of, well, questions like Indigenous sovereignty, which is another issue which today is much more visible in Australia, and I think in Brazil as well. So yes, critical literacy is not a fixed and closed entity, but having said that, I'm going to try to go to some basic elements of it. So if we can move forward a slide, please. So critical literacy involves textual analysis. Of course, what we understand to be a text is quite broad nowadays. It's not just written text, of course. It can be visual, it can be gestural, it can be multimodal text. Increasingly, communication involves some kind of digital component or reference to online communication. Critical literacy is concerned with popular texts. That's one of the criticisms of it, that traditional curriculum should be concerned with good quality writing and good quality literature, so represent the best of a culture, and critical literacy pulls that apart by looking at texts like advertising, cartoons, low culture, so-called low culture texts, and media like television. It draws attention to all communication, all human relationships as having ideological, political, social dimensions, not being constructed by rhetoric or by syntax or by those building blocks of surface grammar that have been the basis of composition and foreign language education. So we get into issues like differences of power in race, class, gender, sexual orientation. Those have long been present in critical literacy, although I think in different ways. And so critical literacy can be about having a critical perspective on literacy. What is literacy? Is literacy being able to pronounce words, or is literacy being able to interpret and position yourself in relation to a text? That's a big question now that phonics has emerged as a much more central part of the definition of literacy in official policy. It can involve having a critical perspective on particular texts, and they might be texts that have a particular influence. So traditionally, critical literacy has looked at a lot of newspaper articles, headlines, that kind of thing, because we understand that they are essential to contemporary understandings and debate. Now, of course, newspapers are less central, and we have online media as well, online platforms like Facebook and Twitter and so on. And then there's the idea that critical literacy is not just about texts, and that we should be having a critical interpretation of other types of social practices and relations. And so even though reading and writing is part of that, critical literacy is just about having a critical mindset more generally. So these kind of, this definition focuses on a mindset or attitude or understanding, but there are, if we go to the next slide, critical literacy can also imply, and especially if we go back to Freire, necessarily involves some kind of action. And so that action we come to firstly by disrupting the commonplace, which is what Freire talked about in terms of problematizing questions. I put a little bit of Portuguese here. Interrogating multiple viewpoints, focusing on socio-political issues, and finally taking action and promoting social justice. So reflecting on the conditions of action, participating in action, thinking about our own teaching, our own daily lives as involving necessarily some form of action, whether we are conscious of it or not, and thinking about how we do that. Okay, we can move on then. I think I've kind of gone over the chronology a little bit that I wanted to, but in terms of Australia and Brazil, Pedagogy of the Oppressed was published in 1972. Of course, it was illegal in Brazil. It was illegal in other countries like South Africa. It appeared in English before it was available in Portuguese, I believe. So many readers had access to it in the US. People like Henry Giroux, Peter McLaren were influential in bringing a particular version of critical literacy into US thinking and also into other settings. Then we get the emergence of a more post-structuralist or post-modernist version of critical literacy. So it moves away from those origins in a neo-Marxist and humanist paradigm towards a post-structuralist paradigm. And now we get more of the addition of decolonial perspectives to that, I think, and maybe some more nuanced feminist outlooks as well. And then we get in Australia in the 1990s this integration of critical literacy into some curriculum frameworks. And then, of course, we get this politicization of critical literacy where conservative politicians use critical literacy as part of a culture wars strategy to undermine teachers, undermine teacher autonomy, undermine public education, reduce funding for public education. And in the Australian setting, that involves funding private schools and presenting private schools as a superior model. And so we get that idea of education as a marketplace, education as somewhere that we can determine a single version of quality based on which schools attract students and based on standardized testing, which treats all people as being the same. And in Australia, we have that through a test called NAPLAN, which is applied to students annually. And we get that through the OECD PISA assessments, which Australia has been declining in, interestingly, over the period that we have had a national curriculum. And it's the same national curriculum model that Brazil has now adopted in the past 5 years. So Brazilians, be warned, the Australian national curriculum has coincided with declining performance on those official tests. And there's certainly no way that's connected to critical literacy, because critical literacy is already fairly marginal. It's probably connected to heavier demands on teachers, heavy demands for teachers to provide lots of reporting, to provide lots of accountability type work. But that work takes away from time for teaching and takes away from the ability of teachers to engage with their students as complex humans with their own social contexts. So I think if we move on, here, just some more details then of that 4 resources model that I mentioned. Critical literacy does not ignore code breaking or phonics or the relationship between sounds and graphemes. So that's integrated in the 4 resources model as code breaker, and there are other roles, meaning maker, text participant, and text analyst, which give a multidimensional understanding of literacy. The Commons model has also been influential, I think, in my personal experience, including in English as a second language or English as an additional language, which is the field that Commons has spoken into. And I think in Australia, we have English as a first language, then we have English as a second or additional language taught to migrants, then we have foreign language education, and then we have a type of education which is very, very fragile and vulnerable, I think, which is education of speakers of Indigenous languages and of Aboriginal English, which I think has not really been central to policy. So there's different contexts for critical literacy, but the Commons model involves an experiential phase, literal phase, personal phase, critical phase, and creative phase. So different types of dimensions there for literacy, that if we can get through all of them with our class, then we get something much richer than if we are able to just get our students to focus on the literal phase, which is what we tend to do and find in the resources we have. Literal phase and personal phase are probably, if we think about our own teaching practices, the ones that we spend the most time on. Okay, next slide, please. So I won't talk much about this, but in Brazil, the OSEM are perhaps the policy that has the greatest theoretical attention to critical literacy, makes a distinction between questions that might be associated with critical reading. So who is the text aimed at? Who is the intended audience? What is the purpose of the text? What are the graphic elements being used? What is the product being presented? How is an impression created by the words being used? So this is in relation to an advertisement. If we go to the next slide, these are alternative questions which connect the student and the society to the text. So do the mothers represented in an advertisement about for Mother's Day look like your mother? Why not? Which mothers are included in the advertisement? What do children give to their mothers? How do children get money to give presents to their mothers for Mother's Day? Who makes or produces these advertisements? Thanks. So in terms of an Australian example, so the previous example was the Mother's Day advertisement. In Australia, a critical literacy activity might be thinking about the national story of Australia and how it connects to a colonial past, and how that is a contested past. So Australia Day, sometimes called Invasion Day. What happens on Australia Day? Why is Australia Day celebrated on January 26th? Why is that date controversial? What did the 2009 Australian of the Year suggest, and many others since then? How did the government react? Could be some critical literacy questions there. Next slide, please. Another example, which is an interesting one because it's from a Brazilian PhD thesis at USP, and it's looking at apologies. Apologies are a classic type of interaction for second and foreign language classes, and Anna Duboc talked about rescaling the apology to look at an institutional apology as something which can draw our attention to language as something which is connected to politics, it's connected to institutions. So in Australia, the Parliament, through the Prime Minister, had an official declaration, an official apology to Indigenous people who had been taken away, stolen from their families, and taken into church-run institutions. Keep going, please. Here's some of the headlines from that. Also in 2008, Aboriginal people across Australia were deeply moved and in tears. Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, had finally apologised to the stolen generations and said sorry. So I think this is an interesting one, but again, you can see the person here, which is central, is the Prime Minister and not the Aboriginal people. The only role for the Aboriginal people here is to cry. So I think that since that 2008 moment, we might have a different angle of critique as well, and think about what is the role of Indigenous people as well in generating this. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I won't talk about that because it's only to make the point which I made at the start, that foreign language education in Australia has not had a strong connection with critical literacy. This is a policy which no longer exists, but it talks about foreign language teachers being engaged with things in society and connecting learning to society, but it certainly doesn't. Talks about students knowing their place in the world and engaging in issues, being part of a global community, but it's not directly focused on things like questioning cultural norms. On the contrary, foreign languages tend to reinforce cultural stereotypes often, or change to cultural norms and social norms. Next slide, please. So just to finish up, I think that online communication has radically changed the way that we think we can and we should think about critical literacy, because texts circulate so fast and so near and wide, and that meanings transform radically depending on those contexts of reception and production, and that this communication now involves easy production. TikTok videos can be produced by young children who can also access TikTok videos from around the world. We saw that with the invasion of Ukraine, where young children came to school the next day having witnessed and seen TikTok videos produced by young Ukrainians, for example. So I think that that's the challenge for us, to think about these new modes. They're not that new, but their presence continues to be ever greater, and the capacity for students to produce their own texts continues to increase as well. Thank you very much, Danielle. Sorry for going a little bit over time. Over to Jennifer.
No problem. Thank you, Joe. I'll bring back Luciana as well. And as you were speaking, I remember when you were talking about this, the place of critical literacy in Australia. It's of course different, but there's a lot of dialogue. Let's say it reminded me of Literacy Wars by Lana Snyder, which was I think one of the very first books I read, right? And that's a quite interesting one, because she's talking like from each topic, and definitely media played a very important role in the discussion and so forth. Now, this is different from Brazil, Joe, because I think that critical literacy has not, have not reached any kind of scale, let's say. Because as you were speaking, I was thinking about when we had the 12 years of leftist government, we reached the most, let's say 7 million Brazilians reached a university. There was really, really a huge impact, first time in history. We are at 210 million Brazilians, so that's already 6%. When it comes to academic studies, universities, let's say research, that's 1%. And then we from language studies, we are 0.01%. So I don't know, I've been thinking, well, I will ask you, both of you later on, but I've been thinking a lot about this scale, because one of the things for me is that critical literacy places a very important role in the local action, which is nice already if the teacher starts with something. But in terms of scale, and this is why we have perhaps terrible results in the elections, or we have all of these waves of everything that we're having. I don't know. I've been thinking about all this, like how education faces a lot of challenges. And I think this is somewhat similar to Australian context. For example, when you think about foreign language education, which is so important, I imagine, for Australian citizens, and this, again, it's a very small in terms of scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Brazil and in Australia, of course, there are competing discourses and competing agencies of literacy. Certainly in recent times in Brazil, the rise of more conservative agencies of literacy in communities has influenced the way that people see schools and see teachers and see critical literacy as a threat rather than as the opening of possibilities for change in which students are citizens. So I think that that's a great question for Jennifer actually to come in on.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we will have some time for discussion. There are some comments. Okay, so I'll leave Lou and Jennifer then. Let's.
Okay, we have some questions coming up on YouTube, so we'll collect those and then circulate them after Jennifer's talk. So our second panelist is Dr. Jennifer Alford. She's Associate Professor in the Faculty of Creative Industries, Education and Social Justice at Queensland University of Technology. She's current ARC DECRA Fellow between 2021 and 2023, exploring critical reading with migrant and refugee background youth in and out of school. She coordinates and teaches units related to English curriculum studies and English as an additional language and dialect in the Bachelor of Education at QUT. Jennifer completed her PhD studies in 2014, and her thesis focused on teacher knowledge and practices of critical literacy with senior high school students, English as EAL students. Her PhD thesis has won 3 awards, and I hope it's available for us to read online. Right, and certainly we'll have an exciting exchange of questions and answers afterwards. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for being here, and the floor is yours. I think you're muted. We can't hear you. Yes.
Now you're back. Oh, now I'm with you. Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thanks for the invitation to be with you. It's really fantastic to be with Joel too at the other end of this continent that we live on. So yeah, it's just lovely to have these conversations. You know, as Freire talks so eloquently about in his work, the possibilities to reflect, or the opportunities to reflect, are so important. So I think Michelle has some slides from me to share. So thank you very much. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time today just talking about a couple of things. The first thing is the Handbook of Critical Literacies that I've just had the absolute privilege of being involved in editing. And as Daniel showed you earlier, and you may have already read the chapter on Brazil that Daniel co-authored with Valkyria Montemor and Ana Paula Duboc. So it's a fantastic chapter on Brazil. I just wanted to address a couple of things about the book and to let you know kind of the genesis of it. So Jess Pandya, who's a powerhouse, she and I were having conversations, and at the same time she was having conversations with Raul Mora in Colombia, and Noah Golden, who's also in California, and Roberto de Rook, who at the time was in Singapore but is now in the States. And we were all having these different conversations about how fantastic it would be to put together a large volume of work that sort of looked backwards and looked forwards. So the idea was to capture whatever we could within our network of the kind of work that was going on around critical literacies, because it is a very broad church, as Joel has alluded to already. So we wanted it to look backward and forward, which I think it does nicely. We wanted it to be intergenerational, in the sense that we wanted emergent scholars to be able to work alongside more established scholars. And we saw that in itself as a kind of, you know, way of doing socially just publications. Because we know how hard it is for emerging scholars to get that leg up, so to speak, you know, to get that publication. So we wanted it to the chapters to be jointly authored in that kind of way. And of course, that led to some very interesting conversations about what would actually eventually go in the chapters. And we know from the authors that they had some interesting conversations about those things. And we really wanted the authors to be deliberately pitching different perspectives on the topics that they were writing about. And we think the chapters that have emerged have really started to push some boundaries. And I want to talk about that for the third area in the book. But just to the slide now, the aim of, sorry, just go back to the first slide. Thanks, Michelle. So just a little bit about the book itself, or the handbook itself. So it aims to answer the timely question, what are the social responsibilities of critical literacy academics, researchers and teachers in today's world? So, you know, we know some of the more classical ways that critical literacy is understood, but actually we wanted to move sort of beyond that into some dynamic and interesting territory that really is pushing some boundaries. But we have, we organised the book into 3 areas. So the first area is basically looking backwards to the antecedents, with lots of definitional work and some deep dives into theory, some historical surveys of the work. And so it kind of sets the groundwork for the handbook, if you like. Area 2 is by region, and it's by no means exhaustive, because really we were relying on our network connections, and largely that was generated through the TCLN, which I hope you're all members of, and if not, you can join later. It's the Transnational Critical Literacies Network. And that's basically a network of about 200 scholars. Anyone can join. And there's a Google Doc where you just literally write down your information, your details, and people can then find you, and you can find other people to work with. So we contacted lots of those scholars, and people jumped on board and decided who they would like to write with. Sometimes we suggested people who might like to work together, and this is the result, which we're very pleased with. But as I said, it's by no means exhaustive, that area. There are critical literacies work going on in so many contexts that we weren't able to capture in the handbook, and we're very mindful of that. So maybe that's for volume 2. And then the third area, which I was involved in mostly with Noah, is new directions and new connections for critical literacies. And I want to talk about that today. So next slide, please. So in the new section, or area 3, I think this is really posing some very interesting and at times controversial topics. But I think, you know, in looking backwards at critical literacy and where we've been, we can really see some interesting traditions. But I think we've got to start looking much further afield to really understand how critical literacies might impact more effectively, given the kinds of conditions that we're working in that Joel was alluding to. You know, greater standardisation, reductionist approaches to teaching literacy, decontextualising the teaching of literacy, etc. So in the third area of the handbook, the chapters, they really tackle unique watershed opportunities for critical literacy to extend beyond present boundaries. Joel's already talked about the fact that literacy is very much contested. And so that's what this area of the handbook is trying to, you know, grapple with in some pretty overt ways. In this section, we've really troubled the idealised notion of the 21st century. You know, we talk about the 21st century offering people bursts of creativity, innovation and interconnectedness. But actually, it's given way to increasing xenophobia, rising nationalisms and ever-expanding inequality. And the pandemic, of course, has exacerbated that. So 21st century literacies is often used to signify the use of digital tools and platforms, but much current research indicates that these tools and platforms are rarely used in the service of equality, democratic engagement and connectedness with broad, beyond formal education publics. So we're trying to trouble these notions in this area. Next slide, please. So the critical literacy practices, platforms and directions profiled in this third area of the handbook, we believe, offer us pathways forwards as we collectively rethink how critical analysis and production might engender more equitable conditions. So there's three kind of domains that we organise this area around. The practical affordances of contemporary text types and associated shifts in technologies that shape literacies, critical literacies as emergent processes, and interruptions of the social production of hierarchies that privilege some people at the expense of others. Next slide, please. Okay, I know there's a lot of text here, so let me just pull some things out for you. So in the introduction to this area, we grouped the different chapters according to what they were addressing. So there's 3 chapters at the beginning of the section that actually consider the affordances of different text types, including contemporary and experimental types of literature, and those of multi-arts literacies practices. And the chapters probe how teachers' choices in these aspects shape what critical work is possible. So there's chapters 1, 2, and 3, critical literacy and contemporary literatures, which looks at new forms of participation and networking and promote transmediality across formats. And it addresses the debates around the use of contemporary literatures in schools. For example, augmented reality stories, and how those things are often seen, as Joel alluded to before, as part of low culture. And, you know, not worthy of the study that's attributed to canonical literature, for example. But this chapter really troubles that kind of thing. And James and Kathy look at, in chapter 2, they look at the critical arts literacies connection and establish a research agenda that augments this body of work through 3 conceptual lenses: abduction, imagination, and emotion. And the work on emotion in critical literacy has really taken off in the last, say, 5 to 8 years. There's a lot more literature addressing the affect as part of critical literacies. In chapter 3, we've got a really interesting examination of the consequences of textual choice for critical literacy classrooms. And they draw on Dorothy Smith's amazing institutional ethnography lens to see how texts organise and regulate people's work. And they do some interesting things there with a children's book on climate change. Then we move into work on digital platforms, which of course is a very interesting and emergent area. And really, you know, lots of different people are starting to look at this from different angles. And a group of scholars there push the boundaries of critical literacy praxis to encourage analysis of shifting media environments shaped by new platforms and processes of datification, which, you know, is something that we're all very much embroiled in different ways. Next slide, please. So then there's another thread in this area, which is what we've kind of encapsulated in the term emergence. And in chapter 3.14, we have a group of scholars who are looking at criticality not as a position that one can occupy, but instead as an ongoing process. Another chapter looks at digital literacies, and they argue that, like all literacies, digital literacies need to be understood as social practices, and that their ongoing interrogation of digital media, as well as the production or consumption of text, is paramount. Another chapter looks at the possibilities within research communities to open our work to everything, everyone, and every moment, as they explore concepts that further our ability to enact critiques of power. That's quite a theoretical chapter, that one. Another chapter looks at the situational in critical literacy, and they actually go into some detail, empirical detail, describing emergent situated moments of critical literacy enactment in classroom discourse. So really getting down to that micro nitty-gritty of what happens in classrooms on a day-to-day or moment-to-moment basis. Another chapter engages with the post-human and the Anthropocene. So they take on a new materialist methodology to encourage planetary literacies, and they offer new understandings of subjectivity that can address the urgency of unfolding climate crisis. So you can see already in this area, there's quite a range of theoretical lenses that people are bringing to the study of critical literacy. Next slide, please. And then finally, we have some chapters that kind of return to the mainstay of critical literacy praxis, with a focus on the social production of hierarchies that privilege some people at the expense of others, but offer fresh perspectives and new directions for this work. And these chapters document contemporary ways linguistic and other forms of cultural capital are used to produce and further social dominance, and offer us glimpses of approaches that can interrupt this social production. Next slide, please. And here's all these wonderful chapters. So the first one looks at translanguaging that engenders diverse cognitive, affective, social and material affordances for learners of additional languages, something close to my heart. Another one offers an analysis of the tensions between critical literacy praxis and language skills, with examples from South Korea and Brazilian contexts. Another chapter looks at the specific ways Indonesian youth are leveraging digital tools to engage in language activism. Another chapter rethinks the relationships in schooling and teacher education, inviting us to resist deficit framings by partnering with community members and offering new notions of community in teaching education, in teacher education programs. Another one encourages the cross-fertilisation of critical literacies and disability studies as a means to disrupt global ableist hegemonies. Another one invites us to grow new pedagogies that can interrupt xenophobia and colonial legacies and manifestations of Islamophobia. Another one draws on border literacies to ground lived experience in ways that interrupt Eurocentrism and continuing imperialism in schooling. Next slide. And then finally, a chapter on abolition, which offers a critique that critical literacy must move beyond the liberal imagination and engage radical humanising possibilities to counter ongoing and intensifying anti-Blackness as systems of domination. I was going to do a little reading from the handbook, but I'm not sure if we have time for that. We may, just one paragraph. What do you think, Lou?
I think it's great. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so sit back, get comfortable, relax, put your feet up, and let Dr. Jennifer read to you. So this is, and I just want to read this because I think the way they end this paragraph is very generative for our discussion. So this comes from the chapter on critical literacy and abolition. And they say, oh, I should tell you who they are. The authors, Justin Coles, Roberto Santiago de Ruc, Huiling Sunshine Malone, and Adam D. Musa. So they say, it's just a short paragraph. Within education, there is powerful work calling for abolitionist teaching and education for transformation. Abolitionist critiques and imaginaries have transferred into education within a growing understanding of schooling as a site for Black suffering. Love, 2019, calls on educators to enact abolitionist teaching to dismantle the spirit murdering and educational survival complex that leaves children languishing under the white gaze with severe material impacts to their lives and communities. Black freedom struggles and dreams have been appropriated into liberal multiculturalist discourse to propel forth the struggles of others within critical literacy. Critical literacy has been critiqued for hanging on to the ideas of the universal subject, in particular from a feminist perspective, but an abolitionist critique goes even further. Abolitionist work poses a challenge to critical literacy praxis that has generally remained within the liberal imagination that fetishizes the immediately possible at the expense of more radical humanizing possibilities. And I think that last sentence there, the immediately possible at the expense of the more radical humanizing possibilities, is a real challenge for us today. which is why I wanted to read that particular section to you. So the handbook really is, if we could go back to the last slide, thank you, Michelle, really is a fabulous collection of people's really, really interesting thinking about how we can move forward with different understandings of critical literacy, paying due respect to where we've been as well. So on the last slide there, I've also provided a link to the Transnational Critical Literacies Network, if people would like to join.
Yeah, I put it in the chat. Okay, Jen, super thank you.
Thank you, Danielle.
Many scholars interested. So guys, don't send me an email. It's already in the chat. And if you wish to contact Jennifer Alford as well, of course.
And there's a little link there to the project that I'm working on at the moment, which is looking at multilingual speakers from migrant and refugee background origins in Australian high schools, and looking at the ways teachers construct critical literacies with them, and then what they do with that out of school, which is what I'm really interested in. Thank you, everyone.
This is great. This is fascinating. I think this last chapter, you know, can make can inspire us to make many comments and questions on how can we actually think of an abolitionist proposal without touching upon words such as capitalism, for instance, and patriarchy and colonialism. And sometimes when I read proposals of critical literacy in terms of activities to be used in class or in books, we don't see these words coming out, right? And it's how can we actually articulate and I don't want to say make the students see, but encourage students to interpret capitalist oppression and racism in a more comprehensive way. And not only in terms of exactly what you said, in terms of an immediately possible alternative. And that's something that made me reflect upon how we are talking about this and not fully addressing the problem, although we are using the word critical all the time.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, Lou. And in a sense, you know, it does in a sense come down to a teacher's commitment to that humanizing or the humanization that is possible through education, because critical literacy can be kind of sanitized into things that are very kind of low level interrogation, you know. So for example, looking at an advertisement where you would look at the way the advertisement is constructed, what are the stereotypes and what are the assumptions, and that's it, you know. You never move into the interrogation of, you know, as you mentioned, the capitalist economy that we're all, you know, so caught up in. You know, so, I mean, and looking at things like how Amazon has benefited so profoundly from the pandemic, you know, so I think, yes, there's different kinds of levels of engagement with the humanization process that is possible with critical literacy. And that's why I think it's so important in teacher education to keep that, you know, front and center however we can. Yeah, but it also goes back to Cummins' model, which is the transformative pedagogic model that involves the experiential. And I think the more experiential moments that young teachers can have around, you know, criticality and praxis, the more we can encourage them to work towards the more humanizing end of critical literacy. Without the experience, the lived experience of something, it's very hard to, you know, to shift some kind of entrenched privileges that we all, well, that people like me have anyway.
And sorry, can I jump in, Lou? Yes? Yeah, thank you. So something, Jen, I think Joe is familiar with it. At least this is my impression. Lou, correct me if I'm wrong. But when we think about, like, there's this division that is useless in Brazil that is between foreign languages and mother tongue, Portuguese. So usually Portuguese has 5 classes, let's say 5 hours in basic education, and then foreign languages like English or Spanish, etc., 1 or 2 hours. So this is the first. But there is also this epistemological, let's say, in which I think that, of course, Portuguese has had the influence of Paulo Freire's work, of course, critical education, critical pedagogy, but I really don't think that they have approached or been influenced by critical literacies, because I don't see them as necessarily synonyms, especially if we place them historically speaking. And for me, critical literacy is a kind of rereading of all this, placing a very important role in language studies, right? And so this is what Joan mentioned, and I don't know if and I agree with him. Now, before we move on to the comments, I think we have some more minutes before Joe goes to vote. I took my holidays to read the whole handbook. I said, "Wow, this is my homework for my holidays." And so I was impressed, Jen, by the citations of Freire. Maybe we could do something together. Like, every time I saw Freire, I just did something like this. I just did like Freire right here, Freire. And I was really, really impressed on how Freire's work is cited in practically every chapter of the book. I mean, in different, from his different works and different periods of his works. But is this something that caught my attention? And something, just to complement what you're saying, I think it's an amazing work. I think it's one of the best books of critical literacies for me, because of course I've read the first one, Constructing Critical Literacy, which is another proposal, but it's very dialogical as well. But in this one, I think we have this social practice really explained through this humanizing process that you're saying. The focus is like the students as human beings through different lenses, different perspectives, experiences, even in the chapters in which, like, especially here, our colleagues here from around Brazil, even when they mention, look, this is still happening, like in Raul Moura's chapter, it's still, it's not something huge, like in Brazil, of course, but it's, it's happening. It's highly dependent on individual teachers and some networks, but it's already there. So even in these cases, I see all of the experiences with that every author brings, really quite fascinating, at least for me, that I've been reading critical literacies for 20 years now. And we read a lot. There's huge production here in Brazil. I mean, in the academia, let's say. Yeah.
Thanks, Daniel. Yes, I agree. I think that was part of the purpose of Area 2 in the book, is to try and capture what's going on in different countries and regions, because, as you say, it is happening in different ways, but we weren't sure what, and it's not exhaustive by any means, but fascinating to sort of look across the globe. And if I could just make a comment based on, I think, something you asked before, Daniel, which is about the local. What I think is interesting, increasingly interesting, is what is the local. If we're so interconnected through technology, and so our lived experiences are now distributed through technology. So I could be living in Australia, but actually living half my life in another country through technology, right? I could be hanging out with lots of people in another country. And maybe I lived there myself. So I think this, and for young migrant people in Australia, the kids I work with, that their sense of local is not just, in this city here where I'm living, it's distributed, and that's really interesting when it comes to, well, what does that mean for critical literacies for these young people? So that's something I'm pondering at the moment in this project I'm working on. So thank you for reminding me of the importance of that concept.
Yeah, I just rewrote in the chat. Interesting concept for us to think what is local afterward. Lou, can I read some of the comments of the chat? Would you like to join me? How would
Sure. But can I make a question to Joel?
Yes, of course.
Before he has to go. Well, going back to the reading that we circulated to our group on choice, on school choice, and based on all of your experience here in Brazil, I don't know if you saw or heard that in the news this week, the House of Deputies, a Câmara dos Deputados, has just passed a law, which is not in effect yet because it has to go to the Senate, authorizing or liberating homeschooling, right? And I would like, to hear your views on this. And how is this related to school choice or lack of school or lack thereof, right? And especially because, as we know, we have a very conservative right-wing government, which, in terms of discourse, always promotes the family, says, right? Emphasizes the family. And I think there is a lot of the discourse related to choice that is also advertised to ordinary people, saying that it is a choice. Homeschooling is a choice. But in fact, there is an agenda of evangelical churches, for instance, to educate some children, in religious schools, for instance. And by passing this law, we may have considerable lack of school choice in Brazil in the future, or more like lack of school choice.
Thanks, Luciana. Yeah, that's a great question. Let me just for a second go back to Danielle's comment about the uneven kind of way in which critical literacy is present in first language and foreign language education, and probably between different languages as well, like English, Spanish, and French have their own traditions and sets, bibliographies. But just wanted to mention Magda Soares in the Brazilian context as somebody who, for first language, and Roshani Rojo as well, of course. And it's interesting that Roshani in particular has so much dialogue with the foreign language group. So I think that's there's something interesting there about how ideas travel and how Portuguese, despite Magda Soares, has a different set of connections, and that what now there is that move. Part of the backlash against literacy is to have Portuguese neuroscientists defining literacy. So the government course is now not using letramento, it's using literacia, I think, and going back to alphabetization. And the course, I believe, I'm enrolled in this course, the one provided by MEC on literacy. They have subtitles because they have no Brazilian presenters. All their presenters are Portuguese, and they're speaking a Portuguese that's not immediately intelligible to the audience. So there's been an attempt to evacuate the local totally by having consultants from Portugal who might have more authority because they're in a different field, which is brain science, neuroscience, and that I think is a bit connected to the question you did ask, Luciana, about homeschooling, because it's about a kind of a substitution of a school, which is seen as a site which is dangerous, with the home, where a different set of materials can be used, which is provided by the church. And the homeschooling movement is diverse. There are different reasons that people like to educate their students at home. One of those reasons is that schools can be narrow, intolerant, damaging. And of course, what we're trying to do is to make schools inclusive and healthy spaces, so that side of the reason why parents might be doing homeschooling is, the push factor out of schools is not so strong. But there is a distinctive model of homeschooling which is about protecting or removing students from a wider social contact. And that comes from the US. So it's present in Australia as well, the homeschooling movement. It hasn't had much popularity. I think in Brazil it won't be very popular. I think one thing that the pandemic showed was that parents struggle to teach their own children at home, or even to put up with them. So I think that it's an ideological argument, basically, and issue. So I think that it's symbolic more than practical. I don't imagine there will be large numbers moving to homeschooling if it's allowed legally. And of course, there are schools in Australia and in Brazil that already teach similar kinds of teachings to what the evangelical homeschooling movement is concerned with. So I think, part of it is an ideological move to promote the family as the source of authority, the nuclear heterosexual family as the source of authority, not teachers. That's also evident in the policy that a guy called Nedeling, is that his name, produced in Brazil, who was the Secretário de Alfabetização, some kind of bureaucrat responsible for producing the literacy policy, which says the primary person responsible for literacy is the family, and that the role of the teacher and the school is to teach decoding. Interpretation is up to the family to guide their children on how to interpret texts and which texts they should be reading. So a reduction of the role of the school teacher to really just teaching phonics. And so there is a convergence there between a model of literacy and a model of a society in which, yes, there is a nuclear family that has full authority over a child, and that comes into conflict with rights of the child, where there might be a right to the child in conflict to the right of the parents. And in Australia, where school choice has been promoted as the right that must be defended in education policy, that ends up also privileging parent rights, sometimes over children's rights. And in particular, in Australia, there has been an election issue because private schools, religious schools, are excluded from legislation to protect rights, the rights of children and the rights of teachers against discrimination. So the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984 does not apply to private schools. So those schools can discriminate on the basis of teachers being unmarried, teachers being gay, students identifying as a different gender to their birth sex, and so on. So there is in Australia, because of this very strong emphasis on private school provision and school choice as a right, removing schools from another set of rights. And actually that has been an issue in the present election because the current government produced legislation that would strengthen the right of schools to discriminate against students and against teachers, and to expel students and to sack teachers. So that's certainly been a big controversy recently here.
Well, the thing is, you left us, right, Joe? No, this is what we have now. Tell me if this is not depressing. I get depressed every time we like this national plan for literacy or alphabetization. It's made by Nadaline. It's the back to phonics, right? Jen, would you like to join us? Or
Well, just to ask a question, really. In Australia, we have this thing called unschooling, which is becoming more and more popular. And I just wondered whether that was actually happening in Brazil as well.
There is a movement. I'm not an expert in it by all means, but there is a movement among highly educated people who get together to unschool their kids. And here in São Paulo, there are a number of groups. There are some who have been studied in USP, in the University of São Paulo's graduate programs. So there is a project called Barro Molhado, which is one of them. And the leaders are people who are well seen by the elites, but all of them have PhDs. They're unschooling their children, but all of them have PhDs. So that's also interesting. And there are experiences of people who have adult children who haven't schooled them for decades. And it is a movement, but it's very small and very very restricted to a very privileged group who have, access to property, even in order to have a space where they can meet and gather and unschool their children.
Well, I'm interested in it from a literacy education point of view, because from what I know, the understanding is that the child is trusted to know ultimately what they need to learn at what point. And so, I know grandparents who are terrified that their grandchildren won't learn to read because they're being unschooled by their parents. But it just goes to all those ideas about, well, what is literacy? If you put literacy in the hands of a child to determine, as opposed to a government, what happens? I think it's quite a fascinating space. And I hate the thought of young children being experimental in this process, because, are we actually robbing them of, opportunities to become literate? Will they become fully literate? Will they not? This is the fear around that. And in what ways will they become literate? So I think it's a really interesting space to watch. It's growing here in well, at least in Queensland. I'm not sure about South Australia, Joel. And certainly homeschooling is really growing here rapidly. Yeah, like exponentially. Yeah.
So for here we have, well, just some comments. We just have a couple of minutes. But for example, Cecilia Menges, she wrote, and the premise advocated for homeschooling is that it protects children from some ideologies, just like Joe said. When in Brazil, we need to say that many children are even unprotected at home. So she continues, when critical literacy has to do with forming active citizens, what future we will have with these children formed apart from society and its diversity, right? So kind of compliments to, here we have one from Michelle. I was thinking about the local, Jennifer. So my local is that place where I have my experiences, and it could be a virtual place too. I thought about games, for example, and their virtual communities. So all of these children and adolescents all connected. Because we are about to finish, let me go back to Sandro. He wrote, I understand critical as a rupture. Critical literacy would be, in that case for me, a form of promoting a rupture with the traditional way, form and contents of language teaching and learning. Seems necessary in the Brazilian context to see language teaching as something that doesn't promote more and more layers of exclusion. And we do have some other comments, but unfortunately, time is over. We like to talk. This is our problem, right, Lou? But we can definitely continue the conversation. I think that many colleagues, they they're joining us in the T network, the Critical Literacy Network, the Transnational Critical Literacy Network. And maybe, Lou, we could ask for panelists to say their final words to our Brazilian audience.
Please, yes.
Okay, this is the surprise, Joe, before you vote. Final words. Well, we miss you, Joe. Muita saudade, viu?
Joe, is voting mandatory in Australia?
It's mandatory. If I don't go, I will get a fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Just wondering.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's raining here in Brisbane. I've got to go vote in the rain.
Yeah, too bad. It's sunny in Adelaide. I would really like to thank you again for the invitation and for hosting, Luciana and Danielle. And I saw one of my students from South Australia in the chat, Taya. So I think my other students will watch later. So this is as an intercontinental connection. I'd like to say thank you to all of the USP students and colleagues who are watching and who will watch this video later. So I think this is critical literacy in action on a scale that is very productive, and I think that this community is important for us to sustain our practice and our optimism. So it's a privilege to be here with you all today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Okay, Lou?
So, well, thank you, everyone. It's pretty late. It's 9 p.m. here. So I think everyone, we're between the people and their weekends, at least between the Brazilians and their weekends. So I guess
I would just like to finish with a final word, of course, thanking our guests, but our next event will be next week, I guess, right, Michele? Epistemologias e Jogos Digitais, so epistemologies and translation. Okay, digital games
and gaming.
Yeah, gaming and digital epistemologies, ethics, digital games, and teacher education. And our guest will be Vanderlei Zaki from the Federal University of Sergipe, and Michele will be together with him. Venham, vai ser em português, em língua portuguesa, e vai ser muito bacana. Então, hoje, nós estamos encerrando os nossos eventos especiais, our special events. They end today with Jennifer and Joel, but we'll keep on with the digital talks, the digital epistemologies with Michele, okay? Thank you very much, guys. Obrigado. Boa noite, and see you next time. Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Carol.
Boa noite.
Thank you.
Bom final de